Hello all, my name is Sofia Nicole Barreiro, and today I will be presenting the following case study on Brazil. Just as a brief overview of the presentation, I would like to illustrate which topics will be covered in chronological order. So we will begin with the historical background of Brazil, and then move on to Ordem e Progresso, Brazil's infamous institutions, then the rise of a global power, Brazil's economy, and then Saúde e Educação, health and education in Brazil, and then we will conclude the presentation and include the citations at the end. So the Portuguese arrived in 1500 when Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived after being blown off course on his way to India. He claimed the territory for the Portuguese crown, though Portugal initially paid little attention to it. The Portuguese found the lands sparsely populated by 1 to 6 million indigenous Americans, and the lands offered no apparent mineral resources. Later in the 1530s, the Portuguese crown attempted to take more permanent control of Brazil. The government dished out massive territories to nobles who were willing to settle the remote land and defend it from foreigners. The early explorers discovered Brazil wood, also known as redwood, that produced a valuable red dye. It became the first major economic activity of colonial Brazil. However, due to the shrinking supply of indigenous labor and coastal deforestation, the Portuguese colonizers turned to a different economic activity. Shortly thereafter, sugar plantations were established in present-day northeast Brazil using a native and African slave force. Most estimates figure that approximately 4 million slaves were shipped to Brazil between 1550 and 1850 to maintain the Portuguese Empire's economic success. The discovery of gold in Minas Gerais in the 1690s generated massive wealth for the Portuguese colonizers, but it also led to a heightened sentiment and demand for increased autonomy. This helped establish a distinct Brazilian identity. However, events in Europe, namely Napoleon's invasions, urged the Portuguese monarchy to flee to Brazil. The Portuguese crown moved the royal court to Brazil, where King João ruled until 1821, when he returned to Portugal and left his son Pedro in charge. Pedro supported and voiced the Brazilian people's growing demands for independence, and Portugal offered little resistance. Therefore, on September 7, 1822, Brazil became an independent nation. Following independence in 1822 until 1988, with the adoption of its current constitution, Brazil faced numerous regime changes that we will not in-depthly cover. Instead, I will focus on some of Brazil's infamous institutions, the military and the police, and the role they have played in the formation of modern-day Brazil. Brazil's military has been extremely influential in the domestic politics of the country. History shows that the military intervened in Brazilian politics 6 times since 1889 before their military dictatorship took hold in 1964. Specifically, in 1964, the Brazilian military believed that it was their time to take control of the state, so they orchestrated a military coup that deposed the democratic government of João Goulart. The consequent military regime that lasted until 1985 was encouraged by the United States and the politicians on the right in Brazil. The Brazilian military viewed itself as the guardian of order against foreign ideological threats of socialism and communism. They held power directly and controlled key sectors of the economy in their efforts to preserve a political order as a means to prevent a communist revolution. Democratization came gradually to Brazil after the formal adoption of the new democratic constitution in 1988. The military attempted to initiate a controlled process of reform amidst a severe economic crisis in the 1970s. Since they were the actors in charge of redemocratization, military officials were not tried for destroying democracy or for engaging in widespread human rights abuses. Some victims of the military's human rights abuses have been compensated, but the resulting publicity of the military's actions has further eroded their image. Though Brazil is now formally a democratic republic, the Brazilian military continues to be a powerful arm of the state. In fact, Article 142 of the 1988 Constitution calls on the military to guarantee law and order. On the other hand, Brazil's police forces have had more impact locally in regional communities, especially in the favelas, Brazil's sprawling shanty towns. They have remained to be a subject of concern amongst human rights experts who note the high levels of state violence perpetrated against Brazil's poorest citizens. Like the United States, Brazil operates under a robust federalist system, so their state governments control their own civil and military police forces. There also exist off-duty officers hired by business owners to kill homeless street dwellers, including children. Brazil's police officers often face criticism for their inability to maintain order. Just as off-duty officers serve business owners, the hiring of private security guards is extremely common, and some estimates reveal that they outnumber the military police. The prevalent gang violence is of utmost concern for people living in the favelas, but the public mistrust in the police is very high due to their corruptive nature. Brazilian police have been notorious for taking bribes from gang members and leaving favela residents to kill each other instead of maintaining order. It is important to note, however, that efforts to reassert control in the favelas by establishing a permanent police presence in the form of police stations, known as pacifying police forces, has been relatively successful in diminishing the alarmingly high murder rate in Brazil. In the favelas where the police have been able to reassert their control, drug traffickers and gang members have been arrested. However, concerns remain that criminals are just moving to other favelas or communities. Many scholars and Brazilian citizens point to the ravaging inequality and poverty that persist in Brazil as motivators for crime and violence, even amidst the country's enormous economic strides. In fact, Brazil is ranked as the 8th largest economy in the world. We should revisit the historical implications of colonialism on Brazil's economy beginning in the 16th century. From the 16th to the mid-20th century, the country was heavily dependent on one or two major agricultural products whose prices fluctuated widely on international markets. It is probably most appropriate to begin the discussion of the Brazilian economy with the export of Brazil wood in early colonial times. It continued with a sugar boom, a mineral boom in the 18th century, especially by gold and diamond mining in Minas Gerais, a coffee boom from the mid-19th century, and a rubber boom in the late 19th and earliest 20th centuries. The Brazilian government in the 20th century attempted to diversify the country's production and reduce its dependency on agricultural exports by strongly encouraging manufacturing. The Brazilian state has had much influence on the economy and can be largely characterized as capitalist but also statist. Throughout the years, like much of Latin America, Brazil has implemented import substitution industrialization policies. The Brazilian state has limited imports through the regulation of credit and wages, controlling the currency, and even owning and operating key sectors of the economy. In fact, statist policies have often resulted in spectacular economic growth, as was the case during the so-called economic miracle from 1967 to 1973 during the military regime. During this period, the annual growth rate averaged 11%, but statist policies have also been blamed for a number of serious problems that have long plagued the Brazilian economy, including high inflation, debt, and unemployment.